Hello and welcome to the Lloyd's List podcast. My name is Joshua Minchin and I'm a reporter here at Lloyd's List. Reading the runes of this industry is often a futile and thankless task, with predictions regularly wiped out just hours after they are made. But nevertheless, to prepare you for the new year, the Lloyd's List editorial team has been bringing you several mini episodes of the podcast over the last couple of weeks, in which they have discussed the things they're looking out for in 2025. Last time out, we brought you analysis of the tanker, container and dry bulk markets, but the latest episode in this series covers what is probably our most talked about topic, decarbonisation. And there's good reason for that too. It dominates shipping headlines and touches every corner of our industry, and 2025 could be the most important year yet on shipping's decarbonisation journey, as many anticipate that a carbon levy could be agreed at the IMO's MEPC meetings later this year. To talk you through what could be a momentous year in securing shipping's future, here's multimedia editor and former sustainability editor Declan Bush and our editor-in-chief Richard Mead. The first voice you hear after mine will be Declan's. Declan, Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I guess this is arguably one of the most important topics that shipping will face in 2025. We do speak about decarbonisation a lot here at Lloyd's List, but it does feel like next year is quite a pivotal year, especially on the Albert Embankment. Declan, can you tell us why next year could be quite critical for the IMO?
It is critical. It'll be arguably one of the most important years in the history of shipping, not for operators in 2025, but certainly down the line. And that's because the IMO is due to agree for the first time on midterm measures that boil down to essentially a carbon price for greenhouse gas emissions and a technical fuel standard. These are designed to narrow the price gap between fossil and green fuels and allow the energy transition that we've been going on about for the past several years. That means 176 countries have to agree unanimously on something they've never done before, which is possibly the world's first global carbon price. We've seen 29 COPs fail to do this. We've seen various multilateral institutions try and do this, and it looks like the IMO has a chance to move from being a widely considered a climate laggard to very much a leader.
So I think that laggard to leader thing is really important in this conversation. We can talk about the technical measures, we can talk about the numbers in terms of what gets agreed in the minutiae of the IMO regulations that are likely to be agreed in April at the MEPC and then refined in October at the second one. But the bigger picture here is that the industry right now is effectively treading water. It's waiting to see what happens in terms of the regulatory framework that comes out. And from that stems everything. Stems decisions about which ships to order, about whether the right fuels get invested in terms of supply, whether offtake agreements are taken to final investment decisions, whether climate cash is directed to the right places to catalyze various other initiatives around the value chain. This is huge. And shipping is realistically going to be at the center of this because aviation doesn't have an equivalent that is as robust as this. No other global industry is going to be anywhere near shipping, assuming it does do this. Of course, the alternative to that is that it doesn't do that. And then I think we're back to the question of, well, what is the point of the IMO? And the whole credibility of that global regulation for a global industry is back on the table. So it really is very, very pivotal. But I mean, Declan, what do you think? I think, over the year, you and I have been on various podcasts. We've been, discussing this. I'm probably in the optimist camp. You've wavered, I think. What's your gut instinct? Do you think the IMO is going to get something that is robust enough to get us to 2050?
I think they'll agree something. They have to be on time. So the 2023 revised greenhouse gas strategy, it's not legally binding, but it's the work plan that all the IMO's member states agreed on last year, which effectively set its ambition for the level of greenhouse gas reductions that they want to achieve. So that currently means nothing unless they adopt these midterm measures, the carbon price and the fuel standard. But if it does kick into force, it becomes a part of MARPOL and it becomes international law binding on everyone just like that. So we'll see the outline of this. I expect we'll see it at the very last minute. This is going to drag on. There are probably going to be people working long into the night. Whether what they agree actually works or whether it's so riddled with loopholes that we end up with something that's good on paper but effectively toothless, such as the CII regulations we have today, that's where I'm less optimistic. And the other thing is that this will only, measures that are agreed next year would be due to come into force in 2027. We've seen from introductions of things like the CII that there can be lots of kicking and screaming subsequent to that. So how it will play out is very much going to be international politics beyond shipping. I think look to what America and China in particular consider to be their economic interests of any potential carbon price, and you might start to see where the various stars start to align, if I can put it that way.
I think it's a really good point. I think a lot of this is lost in the detail of the IMO, and for people like you and me who are in the weeds of this and regularly down on Albert Embankment listening to this stuff, we can get lost in terms of the stuff inside the square brackets, inside the IMO intersessional discussion, working papers and the various details. But this is politics beyond the IMO that is driving this. Just as an aside, if you took an optimistic reading of the various positions that have been held in intersessional working groups and at various previous IMO MEPC meetings, we reckon we're probably on about a 70% majority in favor of a carbon levy. Now, that sounds very optimistic for people who are not regularly down there, but the reality is the IMO works on a process of consensus. That's because if you agree something on a global basis that only has 70% majority, the danger is it doesn't actually work. So they have to agree something that is the least worst possible, lowest common denominator piece of regulation that all 176 member states can realistically sign up to and actually implement. Now, that is both the strength and the weakness of the IMO system. But assuming they do find something, that is where we're going to see the real action. And it's going to be detail that actually drives a lot of this stuff. But that point around politics playing outside of the IMO, you're right, it's going to go down to the wire. And that's because although that 70% are voicing a majority, realistically, this is a negotiation, and it's a negotiation over climate finance. And I think we can take clues from what happened during the COP at the UNFCCC meeting earlier this year in Baku. It's the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention, for those who aren't looking at this on a daily basis. This is outside of the IMO politics, and this is really where governments are focusing on how they finance this just transition. We all know there is a massive hole in terms of what the governments have promised and what they are actually giving in terms of finance, but even the promises are barely touching the size of what is needed to get industry moving and catalyzing on zero carbon. So I think what we saw very clearly out in Baku was this push towards shipping, certainly, but other sectors like aviation really being seen as a climate cash cow. They want to use these financial market-based mechanisms to raise climate finance. So there is already some assumptions baked into government thinking that shipping is going to be generating climate finance. Now, that leads us to think that probably they are going to agree some sort of levy. It's just really the detail that we're actually looking for here. And the other big one, of course, is Trump. Now, obviously, Trump is, to put it mildly, a climate skeptic, and we are, looking down the barrel of at least another 4 years of a US that is not going to be heavily engaged. Does that mean that he's going to derail what is going to be decided in the IMO at April? No, because the US wields relatively little power inside the IMO discussions. But it does mean that the context of those decisions are taking place against some fairly volatile politics. So, as you say, China, US, whether China decides to overtake the US as the real powerhouse on climate financing, on climate investment, given that their economy is so hinged around this green transition, that's going to be an interesting one. But we're going to have to look at the detail, I think, come April.
Can I ask quite an inflammatory question, which we touched on earlier? If the IMO doesn't agree anything next year, or agrees something which the industry isn't happy with and looks quite toothless, do you think the very existence of the organisation is under threat?
Well, I certainly do. I suspect Declan may have a different view. My view is that actually it's not necessarily the detail that gets agreed within the IMO that's the issue. I think there will be an agreement, and as Declan's already pointed out, it's really a question of what that means outside of the IMO. And I think that's the point. It doesn't matter what gets agreed, it gets agreed regardless. The point is how it is then interpreted. I think when we saw the 2050 targets agreed within the IMO, nobody assumed that that was going to happen. It caught everybody by surprise. And people who up until that point were saying, if only we had a 2050 agreement, we could invest in X, Y, and Z. Those were the same people that then said, well, actually, we don't think that is enough. What we need is what is going to happen in April. So it's the detail that now matters. Now, there is a scenario where something does get agreed in April, but it is still not enough. And I think that's really the question. Is how the wider value chain interprets this agreement going to be enough to catalyze those investment decisions? Or is this all effectively just a waiting pattern for investors to see what is coming out, and then they will make the financial decisions off the back of it? It's an interesting one, but it's an interpretation of narrative as much as it is detail, I think. But I don't know. Declan, what do you think?
Yeah, it's unusual in that it has such potentially vast ramifications. But if what they agree next year doesn't end up working, I don't think that they will bar the doors at the Albert Embankment and decide to just close the whole thing down and regulate shipping some other way. If you get a model that works, this might provide the entire world with a blueprint on how to tax carbon emissions from heavy industry. Doing that, it could potentially change history. It could make a serious dent in the climate outlook of the planet. If nothing happens, or if something happens and it doesn't work, the IMO loses that credibility as a prominent regulator. I think we might just get years and years more of relitigating the same topics and it getting kicked into the long grass. Governments come and go, and each government will focus on its own interests rather than the collective. I know I'm the resident cynic in the newsroom, but I think it's important for people to keep this in perspective as to what it means for them and their investments.
Can I just steer both back towards regulation that does exist at the moment but is changing, and that's FuelEU and ETS? There are big changes for both policies coming in this year. What should ship owners be looking out for, and how will that impact what's decided at the IMO this year?
If I could start off, if you haven't been paying attention to the EU ETS and you have ships that trade in and out of Europe, you've been a very, very slack charterer or broker or ship owner, and you should be very ashamed of yourself. But I think most of the industry is adjusted to this relatively painlessly. But the proof of that will come in September, which is the first deadline for those who are liable for paying ETS allowances to surrender those allowances and essentially settle their bill. And the interesting thing about that is that when you're at the restaurant, you eat the food and you pay the bill, you know how much you're on the hook for. But the thing here is that owners or ISM managers, those who are liable for paying the costs of the ETS, are not always the ones who are running up those bills. It might be the owner who has to pay for the ETS allowances, but the charterer who has their foot on the gas pedal, essentially. So if an owner wants their charterer to run the ship efficiently and get that ETS cost as low as possible, and then the charterer runs up a huge bill and tries to get it passed on to somebody else, we might see some interesting disputes happen as people rush to get their paperwork in order in the last minute. I've spoken to several lawyers who think they're going to have a very busy time when everyone realizes what they're up for, and all races to do this at once.
I think it's an interesting point because, generally speaking, shipping tends to ignore regulation up until the point it exists. Then it decides latterly that the regulation shouldn't be there. Then it argues against it, and when all of that has failed, it tries its best to circumvent it. Only at that point do they then start trying to implement it. And we're sort of in the latter stages of that with some of these EU regulations, but because they've been quite weak, I think they've almost been dismissed psychologically by the industry as something to worry about later. But the point here is this is the frog slowly being boiled scenario for shipping. They are starting off relatively weak, but these are progressive pieces of regulation that will ratchet up over time in line with the IMO's 2050 trajectory and the EU's. And the point is, it is starting to bite. Emissions trading is starting to hurt. It requires a certain amount of scale and sophistication to engage in this. FuelEU Maritime, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of permutations of the way in which you could actually apply this, but it does require you to engage and actually start thinking about things like pooling, which is not really something that most ship owners up until this point have had to consider. So I think it requires a certain level of engagement and sophistication from an industry that is perhaps a little bit rudely, but perhaps not really that engaged in regulation.
And one thing to add to that, Richard, the ETS hasn't cost people very much so far, and the introduction of the scheme, at least in container shipping, has been far and away overshadowed by the Red Sea crisis this year, and rightly so. But it's interesting, Drury's told us that so far the costs have averaged out to about 48 euros per FEU, 40-foot equivalent unit, on average in Q4. But that's going to jump in January to about 75 to 85 euros per FEU. And that's because the scope of the ETS is due to expand from 2025. So in 2024, carriers only had to buy EU allowances for 40% of their emissions. But in 2025, that rises to 70% and then 100% in 2026. So the bill for this comes a year delayed. But if you don't pay attention, you're potentially on the hook for very serious amounts of money. Now, you might think you can just pass these on or just pay to comply, pass on a surcharge like the container lines have done. Fair enough. But FuelEU, what the early indications are telling us that it's not going to be that simple. Shutting your eyes, putting your fingers in your ears, and doing nothing is by far and away the most expensive way to do this. So if you think of it like the dentist, it's much better to pay a little bit now and prevent whatever's going to happen down the line rather than wait and be left with a very, very expensive green transition bill.
And that's where we're going to leave this week's episode. But don't worry, we'll be back very soon with the next installment in this series, where more of our award-winning journalists will give you the lowdown on the risk and compliance landscape for the year ahead, including discussion around sanctions, the dark fleet, the Red Sea, and much more besides. But if you can't wait until then, you can listen to every episode of the Lloyd's List podcast on SoundCloud, Spotify, or via the Lloyd's List app. Thank you to Declan and Richard, and thank you, of course, to you for listening. Happy New Year from everyone here at Lloyd's List, and we look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Bye.